Welcome, my friend, to this edition of the History of Christianity. We're on part 32. We'll be looking today at the papacy and the empire in direct confrontation. There's a real problem during this time when it comes to the separation of church and state. Pope Gregory VII was one of these reforming popes. He was part of a movement that began in the monasteries and eventually became prominent in the entire church. It was a reform movement that focused on two basic things. One was the desire for celibacy among the clergy to be universal. So every single member of the clergy had to be celibate. If they had a wife, they had to get rid of them. If they weren't married, they could never be married. That was one part of the reform. The second part was to end the practice of simony, and that was the buying and selling of church offices. And also hand in hand with that was the ending of the ability of civil leaders to make decisions when it came to electing people to church posts. So that's the big problem when it comes to the conflict with the emperor. But as we're going to see, that issue is a little bit more complicated than it looks from outside. Henry felt that the power of bishops was so great that for the survival of the empire, the emperor must be allowed to appoint those who would support him. So these bishops were not just church officials at this time. Because they had a lot of power, because of the wealth that they had, also because of the land that was controlled by the church, they basically not only had power within the church, but they had a lot of political power as well. So the emperor knew that he couldn't have people in these powerful political posts who didn't support him. The empire wouldn't be able to stand because there would be too many outside forces opposing the emperor. The reason behind him wanting to have some say in who was elected to these posts was basically it was for self-preservation. He didn't want people in those positions that didn't agree with him because they just had too much power. So from the outside looking in, an issue that seems like it would be clear-cut, civil authorities should have no say when it comes to the electing of church offices, actually is a little bit more complicated because of the fact that the church had too much power when it came to the state. So this question was complicated, and people on both sides had good reason for what they wanted to see happen. The conflict broke out when the emperor, in response to riots in Milan, deposed the bishop and appointed another in his place. Gregory responded by ordering Henry to appear in Rome and declaring that if he failed to do so, Henry would be deposed and his soul condemned to hell. So the Pope is trying to throw his weight around. He's using some of this power that he has to try to put a stop to a practice that he doesn't think needs to be happening. But Henry, of course, as we already saw, had his own reasons for doing this, and this is a pretty drastic response. This isn't just, hey, let's try to get together and work this out. This is a guy saying, as the Pope, you are going to be kicked out of your position as emperor. That's a lot of power for a Pope to have. But not only that, your soul is going to be condemned to hell. So you can imagine that Henry really did not like this response too much. And as we'll see by his response, he didn't. On Christmas Eve of AD 1075, a military contingent sent by Henry attacked the Pope while he was celebrating Mass, beat him, and took him prisoner. So Henry had a pretty drastic response to this. Oh, you're going to condemn my soul to hell? Well, guess what? I'm going to break in while you're celebrating Mass on Christmas Eve, no less, beat you up, and take you prisoner. So his response was pretty much that he didn't like what Gregory had decided. The Roman populace rose up. They took the tower where Gregory was being held, and they freed him. Henry called a council which declared that Gregory was deposed on the grounds of tyranny, adultery, and the practice of magic. So he kind of threw the book at him. Tyranny's not enough. Well, let's throw adultery in here. And also, we'll just throw, for fun, we'll throw practicing magic in here too. So again, Henry has a very aggressive response to an aggressive move by Gregory. Gregory responded by declaring Henry under interdict and forbidding anyone from obeying him as king. So Gregory's response was, okay, you're coming at me, I'm going to come at you. And as we'll see, this didn't quite work out exactly the way Henry thought that it would. So looking at Gregory's response, at first, Henry ignored Gregory's declaration. Well, who cares what you say? You're the Pope, but I'm the emperor. However, what he found out was that many who did not support him used the Pope's declaration as an excuse to disobey. So Henry obviously had those that weren't on his side, and they said, oh, all right, wait a minute. We can get behind what the Pope's saying, and we can use that as a shield to go against this guy that we didn't like anyway. So he started to see some people rise up against him and use the Pope as an excuse to do it. And then there were others who were superstitious because of the Pope's words. They didn't want to get on the bad side of the Pope. And so they withdrew support from Henry. So what Henry found was that what he thought wasn't going to be a problem for him actually was. So finally, when the support was eroding, Henry determined that he was going to have to go and seek mercy from Gregory. He had to get this straightened out. Well, Gregory wasn't very gracious. He forced Henry to publicly repent. If that wasn't bad enough, he made Henry wait 3 days before seeing him. So this is the emperor, and the Pope is telling him, you're going to have to wait 3 days before I'm even going to talk to you. And then finally, Gregory, after doing all that, withdrew his sentence against the emperor. So he did go ahead and tell him, all right, I forgive you, we're good. But leading up to that, he made Henry kind of grovel, and you can imagine that that didn't sit well with Henry going forward. And the conflict did continue. Henry went back to Germany to settle things with his enemies. Gregory backed a rival emperor who Henry defeated. So Gregory's still trying to make power plays. They're really not straightened out. They're really not happy with each other. And he backs this other guy, but unfortunately for him, Henry got his power back. He defeated that other emperor. And in response, Henry gathered an army and marched on Rome in AD 1081. So here we go again. Things are not worked out. Gregory takes an aggressive move against Henry, and Henry goes right back after the Pope. Henry entered Rome and forced Gregory to flee. Then Henry elected Clement III to be the new Pope. So he said, all right, Gregory, we're done with this. You're not going to be putting any more declarations against me. I'm running you out. And for good measure, I'll just go ahead and elect a Pope that'll do what I say. So he elects Clement III, but Henry left, and the Normans saw that as an opportunity to come in. They drove Henry away. Henry got out of there, and they start the process of taking over Rome. Well, the people of Rome rebelled, and that started a long period of violence. Clement III and his supporters were able to retake part of the city. So Clement III was left behind by Henry. He was kind of on his own. And he got together some forces, and they took part of the city back, but they still got a lot of conflict going on, as things are not good in Rome. Gregory was never able to return as Pope. He was gone for good. He died in exile in AD 1085. The Reforming Party then elected Urban II as Pope. So remember, Clement III's already there. He's the Pope that's backed by the Emperor, but this Reform Party doesn't think that's legitimate. So they elect their own guy, Urban II. So we've got two popes again, Clement III and Urban II. And this Reform Party was able to regain the city of Rome, and they kicked Clement III out. So now they've got Rome again. Urban II is in power, but Clement III is still out there. He doesn't just give up. He's Pope in his mind. He's Pope in the Emperor's mind, but he's not in Rome anymore. And then Urban II continued the Reformation efforts of Gregory and continued the conflict with Henry. So things kind of just kept going the way they had been. But he also added Philip I of France as an enemy. So Urban II continues this period of conflict between the church and the state. Pope Urban II is mostly known for having proclaimed the First Crusade. You remember we talked last week, the idea of the Crusades came about. It wasn't able to start, but a couple of decades later, it does. And the First Crusade goes on under Pope Urban II, and next week we'll talk about the Crusades. He also continued the reform policies of Gregory VII, so that idea of reform still going on. This led him to conflict with Philip I of France. Urban excommunicated Philip for having set aside his wife in order to take another wife. And this was an excuse. I mean, it was definitely against the church, but Philip was one of these emperors who wanted the ability to name these guys that were loyal to him, to these church offices, to be bishops, whatever it was. And so this was a way of getting him out of there. This was a way for Urban to come out against him. He excommunicated Philip, and he used the deal about his wife to do that. So there's conflict going on there with Henry, and there's conflict going on here with Philip I of France. He also encouraged the rebellion of Henry's son Conrad. So once again, the Pope chooses to back somebody to try to get Henry out of the position, but it doesn't work again. Urban II tried the same thing Gregory did. It didn't work, and instead Henry swiftly defeated Conrad. That leads us to the next pope. Urban was succeeded by Pope Paschal II. Paschal hoped to end the schism with Henry. However, this was not to be, as the emperor appointed another rival pope upon the death of Clement III. So, still not on the same page. The emperor still wants to name his own guy. He gets another pope in there, and Paschal is left to have to deal with this conflict. Emperor Henry IV died in 1106, and he was succeeded by Henry V. And Henry V took the throne. Paschal attempted to make peace by declaring that all consecrations that had taken place during the previous reign were valid. So Paschal kind of holds out the olive branch. He says, all right, any of the appointments you made to any of those offices, they're all good. We're not going to kick them out. They're good to go. They can stay in office. But you can imagine there's a but to this. But he also declared that future lay investitures were unacceptable. So basically he's saying everybody that's in, they're in. We're not going to get rid of them, but you can't make any more. Well, Henry V didn't go along with that. So now Paschal II is in conflict with the new emperor. Cannot get on the same page, cannot make peace. The emperor see it one way, the pope see it a different way, and they're not going to be on the same page yet either. So King Henry V waited 3 years to respond to the pope. He let it go for 3 years. He had other things to deal with, but when he got down to dealing with it, his response was he invaded Italy. So he kind of did the same thing that Henry IV had done. He just brings military in. And Paschal was forced to reach a compromise with this. Henry and Paschal agreed that the emperor would give up all right of investiture of bishops as long as the church gave up all the feudal privileges that prelates enjoyed. So here's the situation. I kind of talked about it earlier, but the emperor is not saying that he has to make these positions, that he has to elect these guys. But what he is saying is, if they're going to have as much power as they do, if they're going to keep the wealth, if they're going to keep the influence, if they're going to have significant political power, then I have to be involved in this process. I can't afford to let a bunch of guys that don't support me hold these powerful positions. So here's a reasonable compromise. I won't get involved in it anymore. No more will I try to pick any of these guys. But in exchange, they have to lose all their political power. Now, that seems like a reasonable way to solve this problem. And it would solve the problem because the civil authorities wouldn't need to make these choices because the bishops would lose their ability to become powerful political figures. It seemed like a reasonable solution to us, but it wasn't accepted. Soon the prelates reacted violently to their loss of temporal power. The bottom line is these guys wanted that power. They didn't see it being a conflict that church authorities had tremendous civil power as well. They wanted it. They wanted the money, the wealth. They wanted the influence. They wanted the lands. They wanted to have a say in the government. And they were not willing to accept that they were going to lose that. So that wasn't accepted. In fact, the people of Rome rebelled against the emperor, and in response, Henry took the pope as well as several cardinals and bishops prisoner, and he left the city with them. So again, we're right back where we were. We got rival popes, we've got armed conflict going on in the city. It's just a big mess. Well, eventually Henry did return the pope to Rome and went back to Germany, and as part of that, the pope crowned Henry king. And they did it in a private ceremony because they knew the people were not having what was going on. But that was kind of the move to try to get some peace going. However, there's still going to be problems to come. And these problems are going to be problems for Henry V. In Germany, Henry faced the rebellion of many among the high clergy and the nobility. So they're not liking this system. They don't want to lose their power. And so he gets home to find that they didn't go along with what he suggested. They're going out against him. Many German prelates excommunicated the emperor and called regional synods to condemn the emperor. Now, they're outright rebelling against what he decided. He doesn't like it. Henry appealed to Paschal, who suggested the emperor call a council. So he reaches out to Paschal II. What can I do to solve this problem? And Paschal says, well, just call a council. Well, Henry couldn't do that. He feared that a council would decide against him, which they would have. So he just decided, well, that isn't going to work, so I'll just bring force again. That seems to work. So he opted for a renewed use of force. Henry again invaded Italy, and Pope Paschal fled to San Angelo, the castle in San Angelo, and he died there. He spent the rest of his life there and died. Well, that brings us to the next pope, Pope Calixtus II. Gelasius II was actually named pope after Paschal, but he didn't make it very long. He died after 1 year of just turmoil. Don't have time to get into it, but nothing really went well for him at all. So he made it for about a year, and he was gone. The next pope to come around then was Calixtus II, who was a relative of Henry V. So here's a relative of the emperor. He's in power now. Maybe we can get on the same page. Maybe we can get some things straightened out. Well, finally they did. An agreement was reached at the Concordat of Worms in AD 1122. It was decided that prelates would be elected freely, but in the presence of the emperor or his representatives. So the compromise is, all right, you can make the choices. The emperor's not going to directly decide who takes these positions, but the emperor or somebody that represents the emperor is going to be in the room when the decisions are made, and obviously is going to have influence on this. So this was a way to kind of try to solve the problem of the emperor needing to have some kind of say in who was taking these powerful posts, so that he didn't get a bunch of political enemies in positions of authority. So that was the decision they made. And in response to that, civil authorities would be the ones to grant all feudal rights, privileges, and possessions. So the positions in the church were elected by the church, but as far as it went for the government part of it, the civil authority, the right to be feudal lords, the civil authorities would be the ones who would make those decisions. And so it was a compromise that kind of served both ends that they made here. The emperor also agreed to return to the church all of its possessions, so things that had been taken through these different conflicts, they gave it all back. And this agreement put an end to this series of confrontations between the papacy and the empire. So you see with this what problems were going on and why they were happening. You see that on both sides there is right and wrong. Both sides are trying to keep their power intact, and it leads to problems, as usually that always does. So what conclusions can we draw from this period of history? In the end, the program of reforming the Pope succeeded. What that means is what they wanted to do, they were able to accomplish. It doesn't mean that the way it happened was good, or that we look back on history and don't see that there were some problems with it and don't agree with it. It just means that what these reformers wanted to accomplish as far as reforming the papacy, it happened. It went through. They were able to say, we succeeded in doing what we came here to do. One of the big ones, the rule of clerical celibacy, became universal in the Western Church, and simony almost disappeared for a while. So they were able to get this idea of, if you're in any position at all in the church, you have to be celibate. They got that through. They finally won that fight, and they were able to significantly decrease simony. They almost succeeded in getting rid of it, but not quite. And we know from history it's going to come back around again. But for now, they at least did significantly reduce it, and it basically disappeared during that time, but it's going to rear its head back again later on. The power of the papacy continued to grow into the 13th century, and kind of that 13th century is when it reached its most powerful, as far as not only in the church, but the government, the world at large. So that was another thing that these reformers wanted to do. They wanted to centralize power, and the way to do that was to centralize it with one key figure, and that was the Pope. And they were able to accomplish that. However, the controversy over the appointment and investiture of prelates shows that the reformist popes did not insist on the monastic ideal of poverty. So the big monastic ideal that they carried over, and remember from last week, this movement started in the monasteries and it moved on to universally to the rest of the church. But the big thing they wanted to bring from the monasteries to the rest of the church was this clerical celibacy. And they were able to do that, so they held that ideal up. But the monastic ideal of poverty, the idea that in the monasteries you're not supposed to have possessions, you're supposed to be working, you're not supposed to just be living real high, that one didn't carry over. It really wasn't carrying over in the monasteries either. But they didn't insist on it, and that led to this whole problem that they're having between the church and the state. They want to have their wealth, they want to have their power, they want to have their influence. They don't want to lose it. And when the suggestion was made that they did lose it, it was open rebellion by everybody in the church. They were not having it. And because bishops could afford rich courts and even armies, rulers had to make sure that loyal people occupied those positions. It's really easy. This isn't a hard thing to figure out. These emperors knew if they just let this go unchecked, where you had a significant amount of leaders in the church that also held strong political power, a lot of authority, a lot of wealth, a lot of influence, if you just let that be anybody that came along, they could easily put people in those positions to get rid of the emperor, or just naturally through some guys getting through that didn't like them would cause them problems. That doesn't make for a very stable government, and it's very practical, and it's absolutely understandable that these guys said no. You can't just have unchecked power. There has to be some middle ground here. And the church leadership didn't want to do that. And it led to the problems that happened, eventually the compromise that was made. And overall, we have to understand something. We call this successful, but in one way it wasn't. In refusing to relinquish claim to the power and resources of great feudal lords, the reformist pope supported a system in which the possessions of the church were used for personal profit and for achieving the ambitious personal goals of bishops and other church leaders. So the bottom line is there's more reform that's needed. Reform at this time did accomplish some of the things that it needed to accomplish. It helped greatly in getting rid of simony, the buying and selling of church offices. That was a horrible practice that needed to go away. But on the other hand, during this time, because of the desire to centralize power with the Pope and the church, they got rid of the idea that people could read the Bible in their own language. They got rid of all that. They wanted things to be where people had to come to the church to get anything that they got. Forgiveness of sins, even reading scripture, being able to understand it and know what to do. You had to go to the church for that. You couldn't get it outside. You couldn't get it on your own. So that's a terrible thing that happened. So while there was reform, all the reform was not good. And even the reform that was good didn't go nearly far enough to solve the problems that were going on in the church. There's still major issues. And these issues, again, are going to finally culminate in the Protestant Reformation. There is reform coming, but the reform at this time was not drastic enough to separate the church. In fact, the church supported it. The reform that is coming is going to be so drastic that there's a split. And we know that from history, obviously. So these are seeds that are being sown that are not getting taken care of, problems that should be covered in this, getting rid of too much power for these church positions, not allowing these people to have the power that they do over people. That should have been the reform that happened, along with everything else. You probably throw out the clerical celibacy too, honestly. But it didn't happen now. People were not having it. There was too much greed. There was too much desire for power in these positions. And there was too much desire to keep wealth in the church. So we've got some reform. We've got some good things that happened during this time, but it doesn't go far enough. And it's just one small step that was a positive step in a direction in some ways, negative in others, but it's one small step on the road towards the Reformation time that's coming. And it's coming right down the track. You can see how everything's starting to line up for there to be a need for reform. And this was, again, this time was a big time, and even the Reformation that did happen actually even leading to some of the problems that were going to have to be addressed later on. So, interesting time in history, a lot of crazy stuff going on. Emperors marching on the Pope, trying to get them. Popes declaring emperors and rulers excommunicated and even condemning their souls to hell and then taking it back. Just a crazy, crazy time in history, but a snapshot of what was going on at this time and why we see some of the issues that we do. Well, that concludes this session. Next week, we're going to talk about the Crusades. I know that's a part of history that a lot of people at least have on their radar. They do understand that the church was the main driving force behind the Crusades and that the Crusades were not ultimately successful, but there's a lot that goes into all that. So we're going to look at that in depth, and we're going to see what that effect had on the church and how it led to us getting to the point that we got to with the Protestant Reformation and just the development of the church in general. This is a big part of that. And again, as with most of this stuff, you can see some positive and some negative. So I hope that you'll be back with me next week to talk about the Crusades. And again, thank you for taking time to spend today listening to this edition of the History of Christianity as we continue our journey down this road of history. Hope that you have a wonderful week, and God bless.